All right. Welcome, Dr. Hill, or welcome back, Dr. Hill, to the Biohacker Babes. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, guys. Nice to be back. Nice to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's been a quick 2 years, I would say, since you were last on the podcast. Hard to believe.
I
Nothing
know.
has happened.
No, the whole world's been kind of blurry the past couple of years, so it's like no time has passed at all.
Yeah, exactly. So, for our listeners, I am just going to throw this out there right away. If you did not hear our first episode with Dr. Hill, please go back and listen to that. It's episode 56. It was 2 years ago, August 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. And in that episode, I will say we did a really deep dive on neurofeedback, what it is, who it's for, brain mapping. We talked a little bit about like addiction, what's going on in the brain there. Really comprehensive episode, so definitely go back and check that out. But for anyone that maybe missed that and is like, oh, I just want to listen to this one right now, let's kick it off with like a very high overview of what brain mapping is, because we are also going to share our personal brain mapping results live on today's episode. So
That's
let's
right.
kick off
Stunt
with that.
brains. You guys are stunt brains today.
Yes.
So brain mapping is a measurement of your sort of resting brain's activity and then compared to the average sort of age match sample. I mean, brain mapping is a tool that we use to understand essentially how big giant circuits in the brain work, but because people are unusual, it's not this landscape of diagnosing things necessarily. Yes, you can see unusual features, but you end up sort of having to sort of create models about how people's brains are working and understand them. And it's used historically in things like ADHD and seizure and pre-surgery and autism and other stuff like that. But Peak Brain, my company, uses it to help people understand their brains. And so we measure your brain with a cap on. You guys both did this, of course. Put a cap on your head, squirt it full of gel. And I think we had you sit there for 5 or 10 minutes, eyes closed, and then again, eyes open. The brain's in very different modes, so to speak, when the eyes are open versus closed, at least in the visual system, which is obviously activated for most of us with the eyes open. And we also do an attention test, which you guys may agree is so much fun, that ones and twos test. So we sarcastically here. Yeah. We bore you to tears for about 20 minutes. We have you respond to things that are not terribly dynamic, and we'll slow down and bore you to the extent that we can figure out ways in which your attention's falling over and unpack executive function or the control over your attention, as well as unpack some of the brain resources. And that can help you see things like attention, stress, sleep, speed of processing, brain fog, and other quirky, interesting things about your own brain. So it's a way to navigate what is often mysterious, the way that a lot of us in the biohacker world do now, looking at lipid panels and genome, SNPs and all kinds of metrics to figure out how to optimize. You can now look at your brain activity, look at your alpha speed, for instance, which tracks your speed of processing. So if you're having lots of word finding issues post-COVID, your alpha speed's tanked. You can see that in your brain. Or with aging, for instance, you're 50, 60 years old and you're doing tip of the tongue, same thing. You see alpha as an idle speed will have dragged down relative to your age. So it's a tool you can use to navigate and often then predict what will move you, what will change your brain, change your resources. So you guys haven't done this yet with us, but the next step would be, after mapping your brain, is to spend a few months exercising the brainwaves and making changes in those resources of stress, sleep, attention, speed of processing, et cetera.
Yeah. So I got to experience just one single neurofeedback session, which was pretty cool. And I just stared at Burning Man images for like 20 minutes. So I was like, oh, no problem here. This is fun. And I felt really great that day because, the day of the brain mapping, before I even got my results, I was like, oh gosh, I feel a little ADD. Like I need to go meditate. It was really difficult to stay focused through it. So even before getting the breakdown from you, I was like, it was revealing in a lot of ways.
Interesting.
Can you explain basic brainwave states, inhibitory, excitatory, what needs to be strong, when and why?
Sure. So we have all these different brain waves, and they're very modular, and the brain has all these little bits of tissue that will kind of act like little motors that come together and then disassemble into new little bits of engines. And some tissue is more dedicated, and some will create circuits as is needed. And each little bit of tissue, a little bit of computer almost, can do all of the brain waves at once. And it tends to tune itself into different modes by making lots of delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, things that are named like that. And those refer to how fast the tissue is firing. So we all make delta, a lot of it all the time. Delta is about twice per second, and it's the brainwave of life. It's the stuff that helps background metabolism. It is where deep sleep is. So if you're not dreaming, you're making tons of delta. It's actually literally agitating the cerebrospinal fluid and acting like a washing machine to pull out the metabolic byproducts. It also triggers memory formation when you're asleep. So you need that deep sleep to create the consolidation of memory. It's why you don't remember your dreams unless you're getting deep sleep. And
wait, quick question. So I always remember my dreams. So say that again. You're not supposed
one
to
of two things
them?
is, no, you are, you do generally.
Oh, you do? Okay.
But most people don't, a lot of people who don't sleep well don't think they dream, but everyone dreams. But you have a phase of deep sleep after REM, and you happen to be consolidating memories in deep sleep. So you need to have deep sleep to remember that you've dreamed, essentially.
Oh, fascinating.
Okay.
You can't not have REM. And these little silly devices we all wear that track our sleep, they're all lying to us about REM, by the way. There's no real valid way to get REM. So ignore, and I love my Oura Ring. I love my Whoop strap. I love my BioStrap. I love these devices, but just ignore the REM. It's completely made up. And here's the thing: if your REM is a commodity in your brain that you're not making in a healthy, robust amount every night, rapidly, like 3 or 4 days, you become floridly psychotic, hallucinating, hugely dysregulated. So if your REM is off, you kind of know, because you have other bigger problems that are much more obvious. So deep sleep is the thing to watch on these sleep trackers. And deep sleep is directly correlated with the past 2 days of what you're doing with your stress and your circadian rhythm. And you can see it in the brain maps at rest as the quality of your delta waves, which is one of those mechanisms of sleep, and alpha, which is the neutral idling frequency. So the idle is nice and smooth, and the metabolic rest mode is nice and average if you're well rested. When you're not well rested, delta climbs when you're awake, and the alpha slows down, the idle drags down. And eventually delta collapses, and you have negative delta because you're too wired when you're asleep to get all the way into deep sleep, essentially. So that's a generalized anxiety and sleep maintenance state that shows up. So alpha is the neutral and delta is the deep rest mode. And between them, you have theta. And theta is like squirrel. You know, if you have a lot of it, people have that behavior. They're very impulsive. But in general, theta is the releaser. It lubricates tissue to do its job. All the modules want to do something. And so if the module is making lots of theta, it tends to be very activated all on its own. And we tend to see behaviorally a lot of high theta states in ADHD. You can't pump the brakes, but you can activate the system. So generally the disinhibition is a high theta state. And we see it again in executive function. You can also see it in circuits involved with anxiety. And so a high amount of theta on the front midline, for instance, might be somebody who obsessively bites their nails or picks at clothes or have songs playing in their head all day long. Because you can't stop the part of the brain that wants to focus on something from focusing on the same thing again and again and again. So it's a can't pump the brakes kind of thing. It's like the opposite in some ways of OCD, which is a high gas pedal, high beta wave. So beta is the last real big category, activated brain waves. So if you're making lots of beta in a circuit, it's something you're doing with your mind maybe, or at least perceptually you're aware of it, because things that are in the beta range are really where the mind, the thoughts, the ideas, the perceptual stuff, the awareness, the mental states all live. And also it's very, very modular, little bursts of activity here and there. So looking at brain maps or EEG on the scalp, if you see a little blob of beta in a certain area, it's a specific circuit. And you generally are aware of what that one's doing because it's a little unusual. And you can go, oh, yeah, I kind of noticed that phenomena. So again, back to the idea of brain mapping, we don't know what is true for any individual because people are weird. So good job, be weird. And outliers, be weird. Yeah, stay weird. Exactly. Those of you who aren't in Portland can still stay weird. The point is, though, that we don't want to assume that difference from average is a problem per se, and we don't want to use an arbitrary average bell curve, a yardstick, which is the bell curve of typical, as meaningfully better than unusual. We want to use it as a measure of unusualness, and then find the things that are unusual and think about what they mean. And you know, the stuff that's in the way for people is often unusual. So it's a good place to start to think about if there are bottlenecks. But people can have totally unusual brains, have nothing in terms of statistical brain maps, have nothing in the way. It's not that common, but it happens. And people can have brain maps that don't show a lot of unusualness, but they have some deep suffering. So the brain map's a tool like your lipid panel is, or your hormone panel. Yes, we think about it, we modify the system, we try some stuff, we go back and measure, and we refine our models. And this gives us increased agency more than it gives us like a diagnosis or truth necessarily. And in some ways, the second, the third, the fourth brain map you do on yourself becomes the ones that get super meaningful, because as you feel yourself change, and you measure things that don't usually change rapidly, that's when it starts crystallizing in terms of what you're watching or what you're looking at. Or, these days, post-COVID brain shows a huge hit. Delta goes nuts, alpha drags down, and everyone has brain fog, connectivity issues in delta, slowed alpha and tip of the tongue phenomena, and often low power beta, because they can't, the car's basically driving the car around with the emergency brake on, foot on the floor, and no gas. And you see this phenomena, but you don't know if it's from COVID or someone got a bunch of concussions a few years ago, or they've been sleeping in really moldy tents and have an autoimmune reaction to it. You can't tell them apart, but you can see the signature of this unusualness of deltas and alphas and betas, suggesting there's a fog phenomenon. And if you find someone's fog and it's real for them, people find it really freeing sometimes to look at a brain map and go, oh yeah, that stuff I'm suffering from, oh, it's there. And so you have this opportunity to take this stuff that's often been mysterious and you're relying on someone else to tell you, what's happening for you, and instead demystify it. And you can now look at your broken shoulder on an x-ray metaphorically and go, ooh, I'm annoyed by that, instead of being guilty around that or feeling ashamed or feeling like that something's wrong with your brain. You can just understand it, learn how it works, get deeper into it. And then the fun begins, which is pushing it around. And, you felt, was it Renee who felt one session, or Lauren? I forget which one. Lauren.
I did. Yeah.
You did. So I would say 1 person out of 20 feels neurofeedback the first time. Most people, it's 3 or 4 sessions in. To unpack a tiny bit what you did, the Burning Man pictures it started off with a grid with no pictures, right? It's little puzzle pieces. And we measured on one spot in your head the amount of beta you make, which is an activated mode, and the amount of theta you make, which is that lubricated mode. And we did it over an area of the brain involved with knowing if you're paying attention, and also the management of some sleep staging. It's measured as you make it. And whenever your brain happened to make less theta and more beta for half a second, the computer went, ooh, good job, brain, and was beeping at you and throwing up squares in that little puzzle piece of Burning Man. And so you're like, ooh, what's that behind the next blank square? And that expectation, that awareness of information flow acts like applause for your brain happening to drop its theta, raise its beta every so often. The brain notices, wait a minute, when I drop my theta, stuff's happening? All right. And it drops its theta. So later on that day, your brain was walking around going, hey, wait, I want some input. I'm going to drop my theta. And you were like, ooh, I feel kind of on or something.
Yeah. Does it have anything to do with an emotional response? Because I was able to choose to do the Burning Man activity. Does it matter that I have a connection to that? Would it happen with anything that I looked at?
The short answer, I mean, this is an open debate in the field of neurofeedback. The short answer is no. It's almost entirely involuntary. Points to that are, this works fine if you're a nonverbal kid, who's screaming at the wall. This works fine if you're in a coma. This was discovered 60-something years ago on cats. Cats are not very good instruction followers. So the expectation, the voluntary piece of it. Yeah. And I've had plenty of teenagers in my offices sit there on their phones and don't want to train and still have changes in a few weeks too. So you get to sort of voluntarily suggest what you, or define what you want to go after. And then you check back in with the coaches and tell us what you're noticing, the way you might do personal training. The personal trainer knows how to get effects, but doesn't have necessarily a nuanced sense of your experience after the workouts or what your goals are, more than categorically. So we take that approach and then iterate, every day. We're checking to see how people are feeling and adjusting. And for us, that's the piece of it that matters, is the after effect. And it matters so little what you're doing in the session with your mind, as long as you're not getting in the way of the training. If you're watching a different thing, it can get in the way of noticing the information flow. But as far as I can tell, it's almost entirely involuntary. And a lot of people do the training doing other work. So once they find the protocols they like, they set them up and have the computer beeping at them and go and do their business plan, their taxes, their effortful work. So this can potentially even accelerate the benefits, because especially if you have trouble focusing and you put your brain like in the problem focused distractible state, and then you're training for focus and concentration. So it has some double benefits, but the expectation, there's good research suggesting that operant conditioning or associative learning is improved when this expectation and then reward is met. But I don't know if that matters that much here, because I've trained plenty of people that are involuntary, nonverbal. I don't know that maybe it might matter a few degrees, but it's such an imperfect process anyways, that it's good enough for the brain to notice the signpost that you're throwing up in the information flow. And the brain, I think the reason we can do this imperfectly is because the brain's so good at going, wait, there's some information embedded in that changing. Wait, what's that? And it's trying to all brains are always trying to sort out patterns from the background. I think that's why it works regardless in some ways of if you're really sitting there trying. And you may have discovered, I bet you guys both noticed this. Well, maybe not the Burning Man. What was the game you did, Renee? Sorry.
I didn't do any of the neurofeedback
Oh,
yet.
okay. A lot of the games have activity like a flying or a driving thing. And what people will often do is get in the way by tightening up. As it approaches the target, they go, ooh, and they tighten up and add noise to the system that shuts off the game. It like slows down the car, or the dragon misses the target or whatever. So people learn to like let neurofeedback happen versus make it happen, essentially.
Oh, cool.
And is the neurofeedback different based off of the brain mapping? Like you'll review the brain map and then you decide where someone starts with the neurofeedback?
Sure. So in going over your brain maps, I might come up with 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 different things that are plausible in terms of big resources and sleep, stress, attention, whatever. And after we finish going over a dozen pages or so, probably you might agree that we had some sense of a few things you cared about that showed up in your data. And as we walked through several pages, we found other ways of thinking about that thing or a new thing. And at the end of each of those discussions, I had 2 or 3 sort of like goals that you had identified as valid in the data. I had hypotheses. You initially walked into sessions knowing how you feel, knowing what your goals are, how your brain works. And then I was able to sort of cold model and say, here's a few hypotheses from your data. Which of these things are important? After walking through that and teaching you to think about your data, you helped me think about your goals. And from there, I would build a 3-time-a-week workout for folks to push their brain around. Generally, a few sessions in, they're saying, hey, wait, I think I might have noticed something. And then we iterate every session or 2, change gears, and then map the brain again every other month, essentially. So usually there's a pretty big change, but the 6-week mark in, we do our second map, we often get a full standard deviation against the average bell curve in the gross resources of attention, sleep, and stress. So pretty big changes overall can be accomplished in a relatively quick time frame, at least in terms of how brain things in general work. There's not really most things are pretty slow in terms of personal transformation, resources in the brain. This can be really rapid. For some people, it's dramatic within a few weeks sometimes. I mean, often, but I'd say half the time, it's like, wait a minute, things are changing. So wow. I look forward to creating some of those changes for you guys, perhaps.
Yeah. And what's the difference between people that change really fast versus not? Are there like gross lifestyle things that really kind of compound? And
it's a good question. I haven't been able to discover anything that really night and day tells me if someone's going to respond amazingly well. I will say most people respond very well to neurofeedback. 10% of people respond slowly and 10% very, very fast. The only thing I can tell is that for the most part, the worse things are, the more obvious the phenomena of sleep, stress, attention fog. When those gross regulatory features are out of whack, the worse they are, the faster they change, basically. And that's kind of nice when it comes to suffering. And, someone comes in with brain fog or crazy anxiety or seizures or migraines. If they're really acute, rapidly if you're getting somewhere because there's a change. So I joke that neurofeedback is rather mysterious, but not really blind, because things are happening to you. You're feeling stuff that's kind of hard to ignore. So
Yeah, that makes sense to me because I had some big things that were kind of bothering me and I didn't tell you about them before, but you were like a psychic mind reader. You were like, I bet you experienced this. I was like, oh, how did you know that?
I know it's a little creepy. I'm kind of like your tailor though. I'm like, your waistline is what? Really? Like,
oh okay, yeah, calling me out left and right. I was like, wow, you can see that in the brain. It's really amazing. And not just like attention memory, which I thought I was going to have a lot of revealing information about, but sleep and social interaction, a lot of different stuff. So I thought that was really fascinating and yes, creepy in a really good way. But so we're going to reveal our results here live. Do you want to start with me? And then our audience can have some more context. We can go through the applications and how do we actually make these changes.
Sure. So we'll start with Lauren. Let me share some data.
So if you're listening, we're going to share some visual data, but Dr. Hill is going to also talk through it so you don't feel left out.
That's right. So we have two things we're pulling up. One is a set of attention test scores. So we bored you guys to tears. We flashed a number on the screen, a 1 or a 2.
Truly, I had tears streaming down my face. Aww. I was like,
me too. I was like, don't blink. Don't blink. Ah.
Well, because the 1 is coming up, the 1 or the 2 is coming up on the screen, left and right. The idea is the instructions are to click the mouse for the 1 and ignore the 2, right? And that sounds really easy, but the computer's going 1, 1, 2, that slowly. And that's slow enough to unload a lot of the automatic attention resources and put you into a time window that you have to bring things online voluntarily that are rather transient, brief resources. And that means there's nothing sort of cognitive to do. You can't game it, nothing to practice, no strategies work. And we really see how things are when you unload your resources. And we measured yours, and the way these things are scored, you can think of the middle of a bell curve being the score of 100 and plus or minus 15 points being pretty typical. So 85 to 115 is rather typical. You get above 115, you're kind of performant, and below 85, things get in the way. And broadly, you were typical to above average everywhere. Is this you? Let's see. Yeah, this is Lauren. You're, high, above 100 most places. But the thing that jumps out, that's I think interesting in your attention testing or executive function testing, is the auditory system is robust up in the 120s. Just gorgeous performance in the auditory, both grabbing the 1 and not clicking for the distractor for the 2. So attention and impulsivity scores, just gorgeous for auditory system. But the visual is only typical. You're coming in about average for the visual attention, 96, and the visual distractibility is coming in at 77, which means you're about a standard deviation and a half off the mean for visual distractibility. So I could tell by looking at this that when the 2 popped up on the screen, you'd have a hard time not clicking the brake, the mouse. And when the 2 was spoken, you had no trouble resisting it. So there's a visual sort of distractibility or impulsivity creeping in, which I thought was rather interesting.
And this has nothing to do with like my eyes are not as good as my ears.
No, it doesn't. The number on the screen was 3 inches tall, bright green number on a black screen. It was outlined in a box. It's super easy to see. This test only picks up auditory versus visual transduction or actual processing when you're really, really impaired with one of the senses. As long as your vision's okay and your hearing's okay, we don't see any of those limits on this test. And we can actually break down why the visual system was less, let's say, attentive than the auditory, even though the 98% or 96% is there, which is pretty typical for the visual attention. A lot of that speed, using a speed of 118 to make up for not being as crisp or as on as you want. This thing called vigilance, catching stuff when it changes gears, the 1 changes gears, is an 86, and the focus, which is catching the 1 when things are boring, is an 88. So you're coming in with a visual system like you're making up for being a little drifty by being quick, and you're making up for it successfully. But I can tell from this that late in the day, stressed, tired, hungry, angry, you're not going to be visually as crisp. That means evening subtitled movies or stop and go traffic late in the day are going to be very fatiguing things for you, for instance. So picking up a hint of a visual difficulty, but you're working through it really well. And the auditory system being 120 means that there's a lot of resources on board. And within one person, the difference of 1 to 2 standard deviations suggests there's some local bottlenecks in your visual system for you. Even though they're not really in the way, they're things that you could improve. And then the visual distractibility, the score called prudence, or the brain going squirrel and not be able to correct, distractibility, it's an 87 with a consistency of 79. And again, 85 is where things start to get in the way. So a little bit of the visual system. I can tell it's not sort of ADHD because it wouldn't just happen in the visual system.
It would happen in both.
Yeah, everywhere. In fact, it is in the way at the level of something like ADHD. But that isn't how you're built. It's not coming from that. It's a specific visual processing kind of difficulty that we will be able to see more of in the brain.
I felt it so much. Every time it was visual, I was like, oh, I see it, but I can't click it. I was like, oh, there's like a lag there and I just couldn't get my finger to click. It was so strange. And I felt myself getting like more and more irritated as the test went on.
And you see it, of course, in the transient scores, but you also see it in the sustained trends across the whole test, with the visual systems 107 and the auditory systems 122. So nothing's wrong with the visual. You're managing it. You're relatively performant. But the fact that you have these bottlenecks means that stressed, tired, hungry, angry, late in the day, whatever, you're not going to perform quite as consistently or efficiently or with as good stamina or high level performance, because things will get a little bit pinched. So for you, one of the performance things, the targets of neurofeedback would be to improve this visual performance, bring it up by at least a standard deviation, 1.5 maybe, and get it level with the auditory so that you feel basically that visual tasks are effortless instead of taxing.
So how else does this translate into like my daily work? I mean, you mentioned captions on a TV show, but with work, I'm on Zoom all day, writing emails, I do an email recap at the end of the day.
Yeah. The places that are going to get in the way the most is when you have to do fine controlled things. So if you had to do lots of small little tasks, you would tighten up and get kind of brittle and reactive and sloppy. I'm looking at a block here on the screen that shows how many times you misclicked. There's 440 trials in that test. It feels like at least that many. And you kind of clicked at the wrong place, not right after the one or the two, whatever, but you clicked like double clicked or misclicked because you misfired 8 times out of 440 trials. And for someone your age, that's moderately brittle, moderately reactive, if you will. And so it looks a little bit, again, impulsive. However, you only moved your hand on the mouse 74 times. So between the trials, people lift their hand, put it back down. And the average score is 110 here, and you're holding still, moving 74 times. So this illustrates again that it's not ADHD, but it's sort of like a brittleness and a tightness. And ADHD is a very high number. People move around a lot. They flail. They're kind of disinhibited. You're like, okay, don't misfire. Okay, tight. Don't misfire. Misfire. Oh, aim.
Stress.
Yeah. So, metaphorically, 2 cars barreling down the highway. One of them has no brakes, and that's ADHD. You have the e-brake stuck on, and you've pushed the gas pedal up. And so it's leaving you more reactive. So when you do get cut off, you twitch the wheel and you're 3 lanes over, just like the ADHD car. But it's because your gas pedal's pushed up, not because your brakes are sloppy. So it's brittle and reactive, not hyperactive, not disinhibited. This test distinguishes those two things. It shows the degree of problem as impulsive, but then when we drill down, it shows this as actually more of a stress and fatigue phenomena, creating an ADHD-like visual impulsivity.
I would like to not be brittle. That is not a word I would like to associate with.
Yeah, you're working way too hard for okay performance, considering everywhere else you're amazing. This is a pretty big bottleneck for you, considering, relative to everything else.
Yeah.
So would that mean that when Lauren is having like a really busy, stressful day, the ADD kind of like things worsen?
Yeah, she'll make a lot more mistakes visually. She'll get more brittle, more reactive. She'll be more error prone. Some other stuff in her brain makes you suggest that she also gets kind of like burnt out and amotivated when that happens. Like this kind of like oh, I can't, leave me alone. Too much is building up kind of stuff, I would guess, from some of her brain map stuff. So I would guess that the visual things is just taking too much work. It's not very efficient. It's performant adequately, but you're not adequate everywhere else. So it becomes something to get annoyed. Like, as your doctor, I'd be like, oh, it's fine. But as a coach, I'm like, hey, wait a minute. That's an opportunity to bring up your performance, because we can have you perform about the same, but with way less effort, basically. And after doing, 6 weeks of neurofeedback, I would expect you to do that test again and be like, wait, is that the same test? It was way easier. Because you're not having to sit there and manage every little second of attention. It'll be much more automatic and under your control, basically, is the idea.
Yeah, I definitely want that. I notice now when my brain's getting a little tired that I will choose to not push through, because I notice it's painful. It's painful when I do.
So we have now your brain maps, which are these colored circles here, and they're showing how unusual your brain waves are. And for the most part, again, people are a little weird. Let me make this a bit bigger. And we see that we're looking at the amount of brain waves relative to the average person, colored circles for those folks who are watching a video. And everything's a bell curve where blue is cold numbers, low amounts of brain waves, and red is hot numbers, large amounts of brain waves. And what you're seeing for you here, Lauren, is that you make lots of beta waves or gas pedal waves in a few places. And you also make some extra delta waves, as metabolically slow and sluggish brain waves, a couple of places. And the place the beta waves are kind of stuck in high gear, you can think of this like a cramped muscle or cramped resource. And there's there's probably two places the beta waves are cramped up. One of them is behind the right ear. You can see some orange and dark red, extra amplitude, a couple, 3 standard deviations higher than average. You also see some red lines, which are showing the connectivity back there. It's a bit locked up, not just in beta, the gas pedal, but also in theta, which is lubrication. So we're seeing an area behind the right ear, which is making a lot of beta waves, a lot of activity, and a lot of theta waves. So it's like not very well filtered activity. And this is the part of the brain that brings the world into the mind. I call it the princess and the pea area, because when you tend to have a lot of brain waves like this, it's hard to filter information that comes in, and everything gets a bit much. So I might guess that you find things irritating in a sensory way first, like your friend chewing drives you nuts, or the siren going by goes right through you like nails on chalkboard kind of stuff. And it's hard to find that gain knob to turn down the world. That also social information comes in that way. And so social information can get kind of loud. And it can be kind of a bit much to deal with people's faces, their anger, their loud voices, that kind of stuff. So
yes.
When we first talked, I was like, are these things true? And you were like, yeah, it sounds right. So therefore, I know these are relevant. If you were like, nope, I don't think so, then I wouldn't believe these things are all that interesting. I mean, your sister, Renee, you also show a similar area, just to give a visual. Let's see. Behind the right ear.
I resonate with a lot of that. Yeah.
But you see, here, I'll go to page 2, which is the patterns. So you can see the same patterns, and look at this. So I wouldn't know, look at the two of you guys. I would guess for both of you, I probably did guess for both of you, that you have that sort of sensory and social irritability. Behind the right ear, a lot of theta and a lot of beta. But the fact that you both have it is kind of interesting. And now it means it might not be in the way so much as a familial pattern or a familial tendency. So in some ways, Renee, your theta that's high back there, and the delta that's high, which is the sleeping brain waves, and the beta that's high, different patterns. Lauren, yours is more of a beta, so it's more of like an activated mode. And Renee's, yours is more stuck in deltas and thetas, more of a sleepy mode. So I might predict some different things. Again, for Lauren, we guessed a little social and sensory loading of that tissue. And then maybe some of that, like you were saying, of course, I always believe the client, and I believe you've experienced that, Renee. But what I also might guess, given that delta is driving that up so much, is I might guess that maybe 2 other phenomena are true for you, maybe strongly true. One of which is you really don't like being in rooms full of people speaking to each other because you can't filter out what one person is saying. The receptive language thing gets really hard to handle.
Yep.
You're laughing because it's true. That's right.
I'm laughing because it's true. I mean, like, even we were just at a conference all weekend, and it's super exciting and it's fun, but like I'm exhausted now.
You're done. Yeah.
Because it was just so many voices everywhere for 3 days straight. It's hard for me. I'm
you can
tired.
see you make lots of delta there next to the right ear, but Lauren, you make a little extra delta next to the right ear. So apparently that auditory processing receptive language thing is way more taxing for Renee, but not so much, a little bit for Lauren. Now, I also might guess for Renee that you have tinnitus because of this blob. That could be a thing you have tendency to as well. And it's a bit less likely for Lauren, but plausible. So
I do. Yeah. I mean, I broke my jaw almost 20 years ago. So I kind of thought maybe that was
on the right.
I broke it in 2 spots on the left, and then I'm pointing here below my
Gotcha.
lips.
Gotcha.
Those are
Yeah.
the 3 spots that broke my jaw.
Okay.
I don't know, but I have a little bit of like the ringing. I have a little bit of jaw pain, ear pain.
Gotcha.
But
It could be. That's the thing. I mean, when you're going to brain mapping and thinking about brain mapping, we don't know if this blob of delta you guys have, which is somewhat similar for both of you on the right-hand side. We don't know if it's because you both happen to get similar concussions at some point in your life, or if it's because you're both kind of built this way, or a combination thereof. And when trying to make changes in your brain, we don't really care unless there's something keeping it stuck, because the brain wants to change. So while I do believe some of this tendency, especially for drinking in the world, I mean, that the kind of brain you guys have, there's a few other features that are similar across both you guys. You have a front midline activation in both theta and beta. Front midline is the anterior cingulate. Its job is to decide what you're thinking, help you decide what you're thinking about. So when you walk into the store, you aren't like, wait, why am I here? You grab the butter and the coffee and you put them together and walk out. I was gonna say bread, but I was like, no, not bread. Not for these guys, not for these guys. You grab your ketone supplements and walk out. The anterior cingulate's job is to help you remember what you're thinking about. And yours are both a little bit in high gear in both theta, so they tend to change gears, as well as beta, so very activated. And I might guess that you tend to perseverate or obsess or have songs in your head or be a little bit like, right? But you know, that combination of the front midline hotspot and behind the right ear hotspot is a classic set of resources being in high gear that happens in gifted people that have all the feels, that have all the thoughts, that have really sharp minds. So that like OCD and gifted people thing, it's a thing. OCD when it's when it's your thoughts are having you, but if you're having your thoughts, now you're a CEO. Now you're highly performant and you can control everything. So when looking at a front midline hotspot, I wouldn't go, oh, these poor people. I would go, I wonder if it matters. And if you're like, yeah, I kind of obsess sometimes. Okay, well, would you like to change that? Becomes the question, not here's your diagnosis, because you can exercise the circuit down, put it down, change your mind, not obsess, but then you'll still be able to pick it back up and hyper focus and leave the strength intact. And most flavors of anxiety are like that. There are resources in the brain that have cramped up because of overuse or because the brain thinks the world isn't predictable. And they tend to unclench and become, especially for the perseverative, obsessive stuff, and the sort of like extra, the thing behind the right ear, the way you guys have it is kind of the opposite of autism. It's like, there's a extra information coming in, the nuance is coming in, the patterns, people's emotions, their faces, the tone of their voice, the prosody, the lilt. It's all coming in, I would guess, in a way that's a little bit more than average. But that means you might have decided to become biohacking entrepreneurs who are, educators, or you might have decided to become artists and poets and physicists. Like this is kind of brain that does this, and you have it. But it's, I can only be somewhat confident of that because you both have it. So I'm like, oh, okay, those brains, cool. Yeah. That makes sense for these guys. They're brilliant, maybe a little anxious, maybe a little raw sometimes with social and sensory information. And I asked some of those questions in our first meetings, and you validated those enough for me to go, okay, great. Now I would expect some goals here for this person, And now the proof's in the pudding. Now it's about changing you, not about deciding what the label is. So,
yeah.
I really resonated with what you said on our call about being able to pick it up when you need it. Because like the OCD thing has definitely been something I've dealt with since I was a kid. I know I told you I used to wash my hands 40 times a day. I would touch the doorknob a certain number of times before I'd open it, the TV remote. I don't do as much of that stuff, but I still find like I think certain thoughts over and over again. I'm like, why are you still thinking about that? Like, let it go.
Sure.
But on the other hand, I think it has made me successful. Like my biggest thing is like my calendar is just drilled into my brain. I have never missed a call or an appointment or anything ever in my life. But it's like, so how do I take that as like a pro and get rid of maybe the stuff that's taking up the time and dragging me down?
Yeah.
So that really resonates with me.
And how do I get more of what she has without it taking over?
Well,
because I don't have the OCD at all. I have more of the squirrel for sure.
Well, that's the thing is you guys can decide to what degree you want to train, tune these resources of executive function, The cingulates really sit at the intersection of executive function and stress, the big areas of the default mode network. So if those things are uncomfortable, there are things you can actually control over. Just like if you had a weak knee or one of your quads was kind of soft or something and was having trouble with balance or whatever, we have functional movement stuff to retrain your body, and you can go into a PT gym or your favorite Equinox, whatever, and work out the system. And you can do the same thing with the brain. So it's very cool. Iterative. That's one of the answers, is not so much how do we get there, but what are you noticing? Did we get there? Oh, how'd you feel after that one? So we identify goals, and then we iterate towards them, and the client validates, hey, wait a minute, I felt super focused today. I woke up this morning, pulled my list of stuff out, and I walked all through it. I felt like my sister. I was great. Okay, great. That's criteria for success for you. And we would look at how we could elicit that effect and build access to those resources over time, essentially.
Yeah, it's really cool. I'm curious. I mean, there are a lot of similarities in our brain mapping, and it's like you said, you could tell we were sisters. Is that genetic? Because our environments certainly have been very different for a long time.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you were sisters so much, but knowing your sisters, I wasn't surprised your brains were this similar. I've looked at an awful lot of siblings and parents and kids, and siblings of the same sex and gender, the brains are very similar about half the time. So you guys are not twins, but you have brains that are as similar as identical twins are. And identical twins' brains are only like each other half the time. The other half of the time, they don't look identical, which is kind of interesting. But half the time, it's like the same brain, basically. The first time I discovered that, I was working for True Brain. I helped found a company called True Brain. And we had these twin guys from Argentina working as interns for the summer. I mapped both their brains. I'm like, wait, did one of you swap in? Are you playing a joke? I had no idea they were that similar. And then I kept seeing it more and more identical twins over the years. But what's interesting, and I would love to figure out the genetics here, but I often find that boys' brains look just like their moms. And actually, there's some hint in the genetic literature that brains are not Mendelian. And boys develop their mom's brains with things like intelligence and empathy, not their dad's brains. And dad's more of the aggression stuff instead. But boys' brains, the EEG often looks like their mom's, very, very similarly. Girls' brains look like their aunts, not their mom, more often.
Interesting.
Wow.
Right, there's some family mapping.
Yeah.
And sometimes girl brains look like an uncle too. So there's, this is true in some sex-linked trait in women. Sometimes you can have higher shared characteristics with your aunt because of how the sex linking, skip a generation, doesn't really skip it. It changes the activation sites basically. So this seems to be a thing that happens, and I see this in brains all the time. But also I'll map a whole family and find, the husband and wife are not related, found each other because they both have the same flavor of anxiety and ADHD or something. So again, it's all chicken and egg, but about a third of your brain is probably genetic. I would say the rest is environment. But I'm only looking at gross stuff. I'm not looking at the subtlety of your experiences, your thought, your learning, your spirituality, the meaning you're making within, the meaning you're making as you push against the world. That's going to be really different based on all kinds of things. And yet the traits, the tendencies you guys have for perseverating, ruminating, drinking in social and sensory information, having the tendency towards tinnitus, were things that I could plausibly guess about. And those now become things that are somewhat tractable because they're things we think we can see. So now we can push on them. And if we can see it, we can almost always change it. That's the fun thing about brain mapping. If it's in the way, okay, let's go after it. If we can't interpret it, it's not in the way. And it's not that interesting. So you have this opportunity to iterate and go through your brain and go after it and not worry so much about the labeling aspects. If you do have, sensory irritability or auditory processing or visual, difficulties, then you have targets. And now you can see if you can push your brain around, and that becomes the interesting thing, not so much about, which label do we pick.
Yeah. So cool.
I mean, as biohackers, of course, we want all the data, but we want to know that we can make a difference. And we actually just had a psychiatrist on a couple of weeks ago, and he's really for not labeling.
Yeah.
So you're just confirming that it's not about the label and the diagnosis, but How can we optimize what's going on?
And also understand what's going on. I mean, if I can show you, we measured performance that had some distractibility, and yet we were able to distinguish that it wasn't ADHD. That's kind of interesting. That's kind of a more nuanced perspective on your own performance than might be, oh, you're distractible, here's some stimulants. Or by the same token, biohacking, I mean, part of Peak Brain's club membership is free brain mapping throughout the year with our membership, which means we have a couple friends in New York City. You're more than welcome to do this yourself, Lauren, if you want, who are mapping all their nootropics every few days.
I would love to do that.
So go see Monica and do a series of maps, racetams, caffeine, whatever. The stuff that's in your lifestyle, you know how it feels, especially. I don't want you like trying random things. I probably should get an IRB for that first, but things that are in your lifestyle as self-experimenters, whatever. I can't tell you the number of maps in Southern California that I do with Adderall, caffeine, cannabis, and like CBD or something.
What do you see with Adderall?
Oh, it eliminates theta, shuts it off, and delta to some extent, and it cranks up beta. So it makes you more awake and more self-controlled, but it dramatically screws with features of anxiety and sleep, dramatically. And
okay, I was like, there's got to be a downside there.
Yeah. Especially for that stimulant. I would say Ritalin is the most innocuous ADD drug that is in the marketplace still. And it has mixed effects. It seems to be a neuroprotective stimulant, which is interesting. But I can't tell you the number of times that I've mapped somebody on and off Adderall, Ritalin, Strattera, whatever, and we discover that their performance is actually better off the drug and their anxiety markers are better off the drug. You can just do that work and just look at it. You unpack this stuff. And as you remap your brain, the first modeling, let's say, of these unusual patterns, because there's good consistency within one person across maps, you start to get a really good sense of the stuff as it fluctuates, how it matters, let's say.
I'm sure that'd be really revealing for my friends that think that they're high performers on Adderall.
Or I can't tell you the number of like 17-year-olds I've done in California because they're like, Mom, no, I'm better when I'm stoned. Really? Let's go look.
I would love to see that too. Yeah.
90 times out of 100, it's like, oh, dude, you're kind of like, look how ADD you are when you're stoned. Every so often, it's like, wow, look at you self-medicating all these anxiety markers out. That's amazing.
And with sleep markers with THC, people are like, I sleep amazing. I'm like, show me your stats.
Well, they're gonna do some weird things to their sleep generally. Yeah, that way. So, and cannabis doesn't help sleep architecture, it helps sleep onset. So if you have problems with sleep onset,
maybe.
I mean, lots of things can help sleep onset, but should you be improving them? There's also some evidence that cannabis can suppress REM. So we can't effectively measure REM. You don't want it suppressed because it can affect plasticity, learning, that kind of stuff. So I coach people who use cannabis routinely to treat it like other forms of adulterants that you should wash out of the system to avoid signaling once you're asleep. Like you don't want to go to bed with any food in your stomach, because then you suppress growth hormone release and you screw up your circadian rhythm and you wake up fat and tired and hungry. But if you fast for 2-3 hours before bed, you reset your circadian rhythm beautifully and you have a growth hormone release a few hours in. Great. Same thing's true with cannabis. If you want to smoke weed for pain, for stress, for recreation, for whatever, it's not something you should do for sleep. You should let it work out of your system, before, like, again, 2-3 hours, just like food. Let it sober up. Don't go to bed drunk. Don't go to bed high. Don't go to bed full. Your body doesn't process those things especially well in those states. And you're going to, especially food, cause major, major problems in your circadian. Your energy flux system is really confused by going to bed with a full stomach, basically.
I feel it. Ugh,
Do you?
I feel terrible if I eat late. Yeah, I feel like wide awake when I'm trying to sleep.
Yeah, I mean, it's really counterintuitive. Yeah, you can see it on the auras and stuff. If you eat before bed, you have an accelerated heart rate, accelerated body temperatures. It tries to process all that energy. You don't get the drop in body temperature, heart rate. And we know that to release growth hormone, you need to have low insulin and low blood sugar. So those of us who are above 30 basically have one opportunity to get growth hormone once per day. That's it. I mean, one little pulse, and it's blunted. It's 25-30% of a full-size young person's pulse. But if you snacked on that ice cream or that pizza or that whatever and gone to bed, no growth hormone for you. And you wake up fat and tired.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And is there a certain window for growth hormone? Is it just like a certain amount of time after you go to bed, or is it like 1 a.m. or something?
It's after you get into deep sleep. After the
just
first
after
big
deep
chunk
sleep.
of deep sleep. It tends to happen. It tends to happen after the second or first or second big chunk of deep sleep occurs, which can be variable. Some of that is going to be driven by the individual's ability to clear insulin, to clear blood sugar, to hormonally shift in and out of those modes. Some folks aren't very good at shifting. Some folks shift hard. So you can think of this almost like another feature of insulin resistance, where people that have hyperinsulinemia will keep it up and stay up, or hypercortisol is another feature that happens, and that causes depression and circadian stuff. It kills the hippocampus really quickly, and you end up really depressed if cortisol stays high. So these are cortisol, insulin, growth hormone, delta waves. These are all circadian timing cues. And if you learn to, you can go travel, you can throw off one or two, you can eat late here and there, but you need to know where the pulsatile sort of signals are, so you can learn to reinforce them and put the system back on track. And then you can stretch it. Like for years, this is not a brain example, but for years, I used to stress about how many carbs I ate. Oh my God, so-and-so says, Rob Fagan says 65 grams. Oh, wait, Mark Sisson says this number of grams. Like and I should know some of this stuff. I have a PhD. I should be able to figure out what the number was. And it wasn't until I started tracking my breath ketones routinely and figuring out my downstream late metabolism in terms of ketone generation that I realized what my own body wanted to handle against my activity level, against my sleep, against my diet and macros. And so I stopped being one of those keto gurus who has a number, and I started being like, oh, here's how you find out. And I can do stupid things like have a pint of ice cream and wake up the next morning in ketosis.
Wow.
Can't do it every night. Can't do it even probably a few days in a row. But like, if there's a birthday party or a bit of pampering or joy or whatever else, then it doesn't, throw me off. I used to joke that I don't want to be one of those biohackers who walks by a donut shop and falls into a sugar coma because they smelled some starch or something, and we have biohackers like that who are basically orthorexic. I mean, more in the in the biohacker world actually, but there's so much of this like rigid, and it's a like an obsessive / faith-based adherence to a set of ideas about how this stuff works that becomes really hard to maintain good relationships with. I mean, I know lots of serious fitness people that get really in trouble with the way they manage their biohacks. And the same is true of biohackers, who are using brain-based stuff. That's mostly because people are trying to look for the edge and they get in trouble trying things that aren't safe. But the risk of getting too rigid, of not understanding where the lines are for yourself, not understanding why you're doing it, what's impacting you, which variables to look at, getting too hung up on a particular variable. Oh my God, my SHBG is super, super high. Yeah, but how's your libido? It's great. Then you don't care about your SHBG, that kind of stuff. I mean, oh my God, my LDL is super high, but how's your VDL? Oh, it's amazing. How's your triglycerides? Amazing. You don't care about your LDL. It's the arsonist, not the firefighter. Sorry, it's the firefighter, not the arsonist. Anyways, the point is, none of these details in the brain and the body are by themselves that interesting or meaningful. But if you can learn how the system works, and you can get tools to examine the system, be it your MTHFR statuses or your lipids or your alpha speed, then you get opportunity to change it, to steer it, build it. So
I mean, Lauren's always talking about like that 30,000 foot view. Yeah, it's so important. You can't just look at one biomarker and obsess over it.
That's right. And that can be why caffeine or cannabis, whatever, is super useful on a brain map. Because if you put your brain in a contrast condition, it teaches you about your brain, let's say caffeine, and the brain mapping tool set all at once. So it really is we don't just allow brain mapping throughout the year, we encourage it. So that's part of our club memberships.
Cool. I'm curious, with any of those compounds, are you seeing any synergistic effect in the training with caffeine, nicotine, nootropics, maybe any psychedelics?
Yeah, I see a lot of those things. I don't see any synergistic effects with compounds and brain training and neurofeedback. I do see synergistic effects with hyperbaric medicine that can be quite extensive. HBOT by itself barely moves the brain, in my experience. It can do something, can break up acute stuff like acute post-COVID brain fog or acute concussion brain fog. But generally, it doesn't do a huge change in the brain as a big sweeping intervention, mapping before and after, very little change, very little subjective change. If you add HBOT to neurofeedback, which is already a very large impact, about the biggest one I know, HBOT accelerates neurofeedback dramatically sometimes. So if somebody's dealing with an awful lot of stuff, the extra 4, 5, 10 grand you spend at the HBOT center is going to mean that you spend dramatically less time doing neurofeedback. So usually we do about 3 to 6 months, basically, can eliminate ADHD or help with seizures or help, banish brain fog pretty reliably in that time frame. Someone comes in with tons of brain injuries and or lots of stuff going on, post-COVID, post-mold, post-Lyme, HBOT will add a third, half again as much impact sometimes. So does meditating routinely. It also accelerates neurofeedback.
So you talked about that on our last episode, just the amazing benefits from meditation.
Yeah, I mean, people that meditate without neurofeedback have benefits. It just takes longer. And if you add them together, neurofeedback improves meditation and meditation improves neurofeedback. So I have folks that sort of accelerating who are not that deep into meditation, 6 months of practice or something, and are getting experiences meditating you don't usually have in the first few years of it, like absorptive experiences called the jhanas for folks that are curious, where you feel waves of heat or balls of light or have absorption, consciousness shifts that are quite extreme. This can be, you can really get a lot of plasticity boosted. And there's good research showing in neurofeedback now that one single session of neurofeedback jacks up plasticity for a while. A single session. So think about that plasticity boost on demand as you're doing other stuff. Sports learning, language learning, athletic. Some of my guys are weightlifters. Some of my clients are weightlifters. They start breaking through PRs of strength and muscle and body comp and stuff, adding neurofeedback. And I'm not working on their bodies, but they're getting functional movement and awareness and proprioceptive stuff and deeper sleep and more growth hormone, and the whole system gets changed. So I generally like to add neurofeedback to everything. I'm maybe a little biased, but I think it improves almost everything for almost everybody. But in this day and age of post-COVID, and I do find hyperbaric medicine is something I recommend a fair amount. In addition, I also tend to recommend people go into harder core, low carb regimens for 6 weeks or so at a time. It's create massive ketone baths, basically, carnivore style, Vince Gironda of the 80s diets, steak and eggs twice a day, 3 times a day. That's it, as a way to create massive ketone surges, anti-inflammatory, healing. I liken what happens to the brain in a massive ketone state for several weeks. It's kind of like what happens to those Japanese kintsugi bowls. You drop the bowls and then you repair them with gold. That's more beautiful now than it was before, and it's more durable. Well, the ketones are used not just for fuel, not just for anti-inflammatory, antioxidative signaling. They're literally used as structural material to replace oxidizing fats in tissues. So you're getting this like
rain of gold.
Exactly. Gold. And ketones are resistant to oxidation in a way that fats are not. That's why they're not the efficient fuel source. So I often recommend the sort of lifestyle hacks, sleep hacking, ketone hacking, which is often a very low carb state and often a protein focused. I'm not a high fat keto guy. I'm a high protein keto guy, unless you're very, very slight, very low body fat. And then you got to manage it, men less than 15, women less than 20 roughly. Beyond that, you don't need to take in fat generally. Women who are young do because of signaling. You have to be careful with hormone. Women's bodies adapt like that to everything. So if you care about hormones, if you're below 40 and thinking, or below 45, thinking about hormones and libido and child, getting pregnant, things like that, really got to be careful with manipulating macronutrients and or intermittent fasting windows, because you'll cause adaptations that are not ideal. Beyond that, though, middle-aged dudes like me are the best designed in some ways for aggressive metabolic biohacks. And so we tend to recommend a lot of them in these days because they also help the brain so much for that post-COVID, fog stuff. So
yeah. Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, that's why maybe us women that are a little bit younger can't be doing the same thing that, Dave Asprey and Greg Greenfield are doing. So,
well, it definitely would not
different.
work. It definitely would not work if you tried to, follow Dave's historical path, so to speak. And no one should do it. I mean, Ben, okay, only a few people should do what Ben does, honestly. Because only a few people are like Ben, because he's really unique physically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're built like him and you have similar genetics and you have similar lifestyle and you can manage your wild nutrition the same way, then all those things make sense at once. Ben's got a bunch of stuff dialed in that's like so high level. Most people in the world will be hard pressed to dial in the 10 or 15 things that Ben does every day with this degree of control. I mean, even Dave, I don't think does this degree of biohacking, honestly. Ben is one of the deepest biohackers I know in terms of actually doing stuff all the time.
Yeah. High level commitment.
He shared his daily routine at the Health Optimization Summit, and I was like,
it's a little ridiculous.
No one's gonna do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a pretty aggressive routine, but it's nothing like Ben's. I'm a big fan of helping people build out aspects. If you don't have the different, like, you can't just biohack with nootropics. You can't just biohack with sleep hacking. You can't just biohack with meditation. You want to figure out goals and then build structured systems to solve the problems in that system regulating. And so I think it's awesome that Ben dials in 15 things and is just continuing to push his physical, mental, spiritual, whatever performance. And it's really nice to see actually Ben doubling down on the spiritual biohacking thing, which I've been noticing him doing, which is kind of cool. Instead of becoming just more commercial, like some of our biohacking friends get, they just become more and more and more and more commercial. Ben's getting more and more spiritual. Awesome.
He is.
He really is. And this is what happens sometimes as you reach human potential. The ways in which you move tell us a little bit about if those things are useful for you. So I'm a big fan of what Ben's doing. But this piece about identifying where the functional limits are, many of us could make a massive change with small tweaks on sleep, small tweaks on macros, small tweaks on meditation or exercise. And then if you have identified goals, now you bring focus tools to bear, neurofeedback, other forms of biohacking. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. Really helpful.
Great advice.
Small tweaks, consistency, and then bring in the stuff that we really know that works.
That's right.
Yeah,
and one of the big things, one of the advice I often give, I find, especially with new biohacking clients, I'm often cautioning them against things that might have mixed benefits and risks, especially in this hard charging world of people trying to squeeze out every little bit of performance. I want to encourage all those biohackers listening to remember that if you don't have actual difficulty, actual suffering you're trying to solve, then the biohacks you entertain should be ones that have no downsides, that are true nootropics and will only improve regulation over time. It is not worth risking some random research chemical or some interaction for serotonergic modifying nootropic because it's from Europe or some random place and you don't understand how it's going to act for you and it causes trouble. So please stay away from things that have side effects unless you're trying to balance those against curing some suffering and you really have to. And then get some support, some medical doctors, some good biohackers to support you. For most people in the landscape, I don't think that the research chemicals and the true risky things that are called nootropics, but that aren't, I don't think that's the real thing to be pursuing. And I'd rather you pursue sleep, stress, and attention hacking, get your SNPs checked out and dial your B vitamins for methylation, meditate, add some lean muscle mass, do some neurofeedback, and just keep adding interventions until you're dialed in where you want to be. But there's a foundation there that we often don't address first the way we should probably.
Yeah. Basics first.
That's right.
So before we wrap up, can you do a quick rundown about what Peak Brain offers? And again, we want everyone to go back and listen to the other episode, but I think some things have changed since we last spoke.
Sure. So Peak Brain is a gym for your brain. And again, we offer this ongoing brain mapping access in all of our physical offices. In the US, we have a couple in Southern California, in LA and in Orange County, also in St. Louis and in New York City. And we have some partners overseas, including in London. And I think we're going to be available in Wellington, New Zealand, Copenhagen, and maybe Hong Kong as well. We'll update the website shortly and let you guys know. But these are the Peak Brain clubs. You can understand your brain and map them and things like that. And then most of our clients do neurofeedback, and we do that process in our physical offices, but we also do it remotely. I would say most of our clients, we send them equipment like this, which is a little EEG amplifier, and we have them, learn to work with coaches on a live chat and learn to stick some wires in your head and find a location, get some good signals on the screen, and train your brain. So you could do your own Burning Man pictures from home a few times a week, and the coaches will watch what's happening, ask how you're feeling, give you new workouts, and then of course troubleshoot as you need. So we were already about 55-60% remote before, March of 2020. And in the past couple of years, we're about 75-80% virtual now. So people don't need to come to any of our offices. And in the US, we have complete rental-based programs, nothing to buy. And overseas, folks just buy some hardware and software, and we train them how to use it and work remotely. So we really are probably the most, worldwide neurofeedback center, I would guess, in terms of the most countries and the most virtual presence that exists. But our goal for doing that was not to create a turnkey system that was weaker than the existing one. It was to take the exact systems we use in all of our physical offices and replicate it. And so that means we're using the same hardware, the same software. We do brain mapping from your kitchen with a live coach on a computer with you. So taking the clinical, highly nuanced, heavily individualized neurofeedback, and we've made that accessible, not a one-size-fits-all system that is just sold to you. So it's actually live coaches who are supporting you and teaching you and troubleshooting as you go. And we find that makes the big difference. So please come work with us. Either come map your brain a bunch in the offices, or let us know if you want to get up on our brain training programs remotely. We'd love to support people.
Amazing.
Incredible. Thank you. Thank you for all that you're doing. I love that you're helping people
appreciate
from
it.
home.
We try.
Great.
Yeah, we try.
Well, Dr. Hill, before we let you run, one final question, if you can leave our audience with a piece of advice for something they can start doing today for their health and wellness.
Get up earlier than you want to.
No.
One of the primary ways to hack circadian or any system that oscillates, be it blood pressure or body temperature or your individual neurons, firing, or circadian stuff, anything that oscillates does so with feedback systems, keeping it within a range. And one of the best ways, the quickest ways to change a system that oscillates is through negative feedback and delay. So you can really improve your sleep rapidly by getting up really, really early. A lot of biohackers I know are really focused on blocking light. I'm not a believer in managing light, believe it or not. I don't think light generally causes any trouble for most humans, the way it's marketed as causing trouble. But I do think that when you wake up in the morning is the time of light that matters. The only light that entrains the circadian system is the color of light that shows up in the first hour after dawn or after sunrise. So you have about an hour there within which you can get a circadian boost from light itself. After that, like the circadian progression stuff, suppressing melatonin thing that happened at the end of the day, isn't about the color of light. It's about intensity of light. So don't have bright overhead lights on late in the day, have dim lights and lower lights and things like that. And you have no issue with suppression of melatonin. But getting up earlier than you want, several days in a row, will lock in a brand new circadian rhythm within a few days. And you'll wake up before the alarm, day 4, day 5, whatever. And by earlier than you want, sun's up at about 6:30 right now or something. Yeah, I get up at 5, 4:30, something like that. Really earlier than you want for a good solid chunk of days as a way of locking in a new rhythm. And then you can feel like you're sleeping in when you got up at 5:30 for the next week.
Oh my goodness. Yes. Yeah.
Excellent.
Wonderful. All right. Well, we will link to all of your resources in the show notes. So anyone that's looking for you, check out the show notes. We'll have all of that there for you. And thank you so much for everything. It's so great to chat with you. And
of course.
We'll
have to talk again.
Fun.
Yeah. I'll have to invite you into the New York City office and poke on your brain a bit more.
So, I want it.
And me in LA.
I'm very excited for my training.
Well, we'll have to send you a kit, right? Renee, we'll have to send you a kit out to
Vegas.
To Vegas. And of course, Lauren, you can just visit Monica in the Madison office there, Madison Square office. But we won't hold that against you, Renee. We'll send you a kit out to the West as well.
Okay. The Wild West.
The Wild West. Vegas is pretty wild.
It is. I try to stay away from some of the wildness, but
so
yeah.
All right, folks. Well, so lovely to see you all. Take care of those brains.
You too.
You too.
We will.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. See ya. Bye.
Bye. Where did my recording button go? Oh, that's so weird. Hold on.
Did we record?
It did record.
Oh yeah, it says recording.
I think it's recording.